The desire to go back to nature has probably burned within human hearts since the first cities emerged in ancient times. But how far would you go to bring the natural world into your home? One attempt to do so that was perhaps a bit too successful is a famous house in rural Pennsylvania known as Fallingwater. Designed by the legendary American, or as he would have said, Usonian architect Frank Lloyd Wright, Fallingwater is one of the most influential buildings of the 20th century. Located in the Laurel Highlands region of southwestern Pennsylvania, the house was originally built as a country retreat for Edgar J. Kaufmann, the owner of Kaufmann's department store in Pittsburgh. The house is named for its location, as it was constructed over Bear Run, a tributary stream of the Youghiogheny River. It is perhaps the most famous example of organic architecture, a design philosophy that emphasizes the idea that human structures should conform to the natural environment in which they're built, not the other way around. The term organic architecture was actually coined by Wright himself, who believed that the form and function of a building should be completely integrated with one another. Wright was heavily influenced by traditional Japanese architecture and aesthetics, a fact which quickly becomes evident upon even superficial examination of his work. He was a lifelong collector of Japanese ukiyo-e prints, and had first encountered Japanese architecture in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. Designed by the Japanese architect Kuru Masamichi, Japan's pavilion was modeled after the Phoenix Hall of Byodo-in, a late 10th century Buddhist temple in Uji, Japan, which is now designated as a national treasure. It was constructed on Wooded Island, one of the best locations given to any of the participating countries, and was accessed dramatically by a large bridge. Wright, who was 26 at the time, was deeply moved and inspired by what he saw, which was quite different than most architecture in the US at the time. The quiet elegance of the pavilion, though ancient and traditional in Japan, was revolutionary in the US. It proved that a building could be beautiful, functional, luxurious, and comfortable, without using extravagant materials or hiding the use of more humble ones, and all without detracting from the natural landscape. It was from then onward that Wright's work took on a more experimental nature, and the influence of what he had seen on Wooded Island became increasingly apparent. Wright visited Japan many times over the course of his life, and collaborated with several Japanese architects, including Arata Endo in the late 1910s and 20s. One can see the influence of Japanese architecture and design in Wright's own home and studio, Taliesin, which was completed in 1911, but which endured 2 fires during its occupancy by Wright, and had to be remodeled twice. The first was an arson/mass murder that occurred in 1914, when one of the house's staff set the living room on fire and murdered 7 people with an axe, including Wright's mistress, Martha Boughton Mama Borthwick, and her 2 children. The second was an electrical fire that occurred in 1925. It was at Taliesin that Wright met the Kaufmanns for the first time in November of 1934. Their son, Edgar Jr., had that summer read Wright's autobiography, and was so inspired that he traveled to Taliesin to meet him in person, and he soon became an apprentice at the studio Wright ran there. The Kaufmanns already knew about Wright's work when they came to visit their son in November of 1934, and they quickly asked him to design a weekend house for them at Bear Run. By that time, Wright was 67 years old and had only designed 2 buildings in the past 6 years, both in Wisconsin. The Johnson Wax Building in Racine, and the first house of Herbert and Catherine Jacobs in Madison. Wright said that he wanted to build the Kaufmann's house on a site which, as he described it, has features making for character. Bear Run clearly had that, and Wright was apparently thrilled when he saw the site for the first time. The site was surveyed in December of 1934, and a topographical map of it was completed in March of the following year. Wright had already started working on another project for Kaufmann, and so he didn't actually produce or even start working on any designs until September 22nd, when Edgar Sr. suddenly called him, saying he was coming over. When he got there 2 hours later, Wright had just finished the sketches. These drawings are also the origin of the name Fallingwater, which Wright wrote across the bottom of each drawing. For their part, the Kaufmanns had never mentioned the name, and would never end up using it themselves. Like many of Wright's designs, the house would be built with exposed cantilevers, structural elements that extend horizontally from the building without support at the other end. These cantilevered terraces were anchored to the sandstone chimney at the center of the house, which was to have 3 stories and be constructed on Bear Run's northern bank and oriented 30 degrees counterclockwise from due south. This was to allow as much natural light into the house as possible. One would think, as indeed the Kaufmanns did, that Wright would have designed the house so as to allow the now famous waterfall at the site to be seen from it. However, in order to achieve such a view, the house would have had to have been oriented so that it faced north, which would have provided insufficient amounts of light to its interior. In February of 1936, Wright sent a more polished but largely unchanged design to Edgar Sr., who gave it to local engineers in Pittsburgh to review. They all responded with the same advice, not to build the house on the site, listing at least 8 structural problems. However, the foundation was soon laid anyway, while Wright continued to tinker with the design. By the time construction of the actual house began in early 1937, Wright had been forced to redesign it 8 times. Wright's apprentice, Robert Mosher, would serve as his on-site representative, as Wright could only visit the site once every month to month and a half. Wright also hired Walter J. Hall, a local contractor, who brought along his own employee, Earl Fryer, as a reinforced concrete consultant. Hall would prove to be a poor choice, though, as he showed little concern for safety and made frequent errors of judgment. Because of this, Mosher ended up being forced to do Hall's job for him. The project was further plagued by conflict between the chronically exasperated Kaufmanns and Wright, who devoted more consideration to the building's aesthetics than its physical integrity, which further burdened Mosher. The manual labor of building the house was carried out by local workers, many of whom had little experience, as well as by many of Edgar Jr.'s own employees and family members. Firings abounded. Even Mosher was eventually sent away, the innocent victim of an argument that arose back in 1936, when the foundations were still being poured, between Edgar Jr. and Sr. on one side and Wright on the other, over how much rebar to use in constructing the now famous terraces. The Kaufmanns had requested more rebar be used than Wright had planned for, and when Wright found out it had been installed without his go-ahead, he flew into a rage and threatened to quit. However, soon afterwards, the concrete of the terraces began to crack. Wright dismissed the cracks as normal and perfectly safe, but when the formwork was removed, the first floor terrace immediately sank nearly 2 inches into the ground. By the end of the year, 5 major cracks had formed, and Mosher soon had to be called back. A stone wall was added under the second floor terrace to add structural support, but this would later prove to be insufficient. Nevertheless, the Kaufmanns moved into the house in November of 1937, though the interior wasn't completed until the beginning of the next year. A guest wing was added in 1939. The total cost of building the house was $155,000, 10 times the average cost of a 4-bedroom house at the time, and the equivalent of about $2.7 million today. Fallingwater's design is similar to, and arguably a streamlining or modernization of, his earlier prairie and Usonian houses, which themselves were heavily influenced by traditional Japanese architecture like Kuru's Pavilion. Wright wanted to blur the boundary between the natural world outside and the house's interior. The windows are designed and arranged to take advantage of cross breezes, and so that the waterfall can be heard from anywhere in the house. The window casings are painted red because Wright considered the color red to be the invincible color of life. Originally, Wright floated the idea of covering part of the outer surface of the house with gold leaf, though it's unclear how serious he was being. In any case, Edgar Sr. did end up hiring a gold leaf contractor, who immediately rejected the proposal. Probably for the best. The primary material used in Fallingwater's construction was local sandstone, though reinforced concrete was also used. The concrete used to build the house was mixed with gravel from Bear Run itself, and Wright designed the terraces to resemble layers of sedimentary rock, like the outcroppings of some monumental cliff, and the rustic masonry also emphasizes long, narrow, rectangular forms. The materials seen outside are continued within the interior of the house, further integrating exterior and interior. The most famous feature of Fallingwater is of course its many cantilevered terraces, which are all supported on one end by the house's chimney. The terraces are covered in stucco, which provides a lovely rounded effect that was so popular in the 1930s. Fallingwater's floor plan is 5,330 square feet in area, of which 2,445 consist of outdoor terraces, leaving 2,885 square feet of interior space. The walls, chimney, and piers are made of sandstone, the window casings of steel, and the terrace's subfloors are made of redwood. Black walnut woodwork is used extensively throughout the interior, its grain oriented horizontally. The interior electric illumination consists primarily of indirect lighting, which was uncommon in residential buildings of the time. The layout of the house is based upon Wright's principle of compression, by which large open spaces are entered via small ones. Hallways were designed with low ceilings for the specific purpose of preventing loitering. The ground floor of the house contains the foyer, kitchen, and main living area. The western wall contains the fireplace, which was constructed with boulders sourced on site. A 7-foot-long boulder can be seen sticking up out of the floor next to the hearth. Wright originally wanted to shave the top off, but Edgar Sr. fortunately preferred the natural look, and it was left as is. The room has windows on 3 sides, which not only increases the amount of natural light and offers beautiful views of nature, but also allows for cooling cross breezes in the summer. The living room itself is built on a cantilevered terrace above the waterfall. A hatch in the floor ingeniously opens up to a hidden stairway that leads directly into the creek and a small plunge pool. The floor hatch above the water could also be left open in the summertime to further moderate the interior temperature of the house by means of evaporative cooling. The house contains 4 bedrooms, 2 on the 2nd floor and 2 on the 3rd, each with its own fireplace and outdoor terrace. A bridge leads from the main house to the guest wing and servants' quarters, and passes by a small pool and fountain made to look like a small waterfall. This fountain wasn't originally planned as part of the design, but it was added during construction when a small spring was discovered on the site. In addition to a bedroom and bathroom, the guest suite contains a lounge, as well as a private swimming pool fed by the spring. Next to the guest house is a carport with 4 parking spaces, and above the carport are 3 bedrooms intended for the house's staff, which, unusually for the time, are furnished with the same materials as the bedrooms intended for the Kaufmann family and their guests. About 50% of Fallingwater's furniture is built in, and was designed by Wright himself. Wright was notoriously averse to his clients choosing their own decorations for the homes he built, as he didn't trust other people's aesthetic instincts. However, when it came to the Kaufmanns, who were huge art lovers, there was little hope of his being able to have total control over the house's interior decoration. He did end up giving the Kaufmanns 6 prints by Hokusai and Hiroshige, but all the other art in the house was chosen by the Kaufmanns, who thankfully had impeccable taste. The Kaufmann's art collection included works by Pablo Picasso, Marcel Duchamp, and Diego Rivera, as well as pieces from around the world collected by the Kaufmanns on their travels. Unfortunately, however, the large windows, high humidity from the waterfall, and lack of any modern interior temperature control provided a suboptimal environment in which to store art. It wasn't until the first decade of the 21st century that air conditioning was added for the purpose of controlling the interior temperature of the house. Curtains were also added at this time. Wright had resisted the installation of any window treatments because he wanted views of nature to be visible from inside the house 24/7. The house is also notorious for its low ceilings. The height of the house's ceilings varies from room to room. The highest ones are a standard 9 feet, but some of them are as low as 6 foot 4 inches. Similarly, the parapets or railings around the terraces are only 26 inches high, which, as one 6'2" journalist complained, only came up to just below his knees. Wright designed Fallingwater's bathrooms with sunken toilets because he believed correctly that squatting was a healthier position than sitting. This is yet another aspect of the house likely inspired by his time in Japan, as squat toilets were the standard there until recent decades. The showers feature industrial-sized shower heads, because Wright believed it would be like standing under a waterfall. By 1950, the house was already in poor condition. Several windows had begun to crack, and the doors jammed with increasing frequency. Worst of all, the 2nd floor and several of the terraces had begun to sag ominously, and wooden posts were hastily installed underneath, for fear of collapse. Edgar Sr. and his wife Lillian's marriage was in a similar state of disrepair, and they had begun to seriously consider selling the house. Before they could do this, however, Lillian died in 1952, and Edgar Sr. followed her soon after in 1955. Edgar Jr. lived in the house during the rest of the 1950s and early 60s, maintaining it as best he could. In 1956, the living room was badly flooded in a storm, but miraculously the house sustained no structural damage from it. In 1963, Edgar Jr. donated Fallingwater to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and it was opened to the public as a house museum. Edgar Jr. gave the WPC $500,000 for the house's maintenance, as well as an additional $150,000 to fund educational programs at the site. Eventually, the site expanded to include 5,000 acres of land. By the 1980s, the annual cost of maintaining the house had risen to $400,000, and despite the site being a popular tourist attraction, the WPC was only breaking even. By then, most of the leaks had been repaired, but the terraces were continuing to sag dramatically, some by as much as 7 inches. Rain and snow pooled on the roof and terraces without running off, and the area was so humid that water was constantly seeping in through the walls. In the 1990s, an engineer named Robert Silman was hired to assess the condition of Fallingwater's architecture and hopefully invent a solution. By this point, the terraces were so unstable that visitors could feel them bounce as they walked across them, and Silman predicted that they would soon collapse if no remedy was devised. Temporary girders were installed in 1997, and one of the heavy built-in sofas was removed from the house to relieve the structure of some of its burden. Steel cables were run through the house's beams to add support, a technique known as post-tensioning. Modern waterproofing was added, and the stream was redirected to make it easier for maintenance workers to access the terraces. New windows were also added. By 2005, the house had been mostly restored, though feverishly constant maintenance is still necessary to keep the house from sliding back into disrepair. In 2024 and 2025, $7 million were spent just to repair leaks alone. The house is still open to the public. Children are banned from entering and must stay at the child care center located at the site's visitor center while their parents or guardians tour the house. By the 2010s, the number of annual visitors had reached 160,000. In the years after it was first built, Fallingwater received near-universal praise for its daring design and jaw-dropping beauty, though in more recent decades it has come to receive more criticism for its flimsy construction, awkward anthropometry, and, most ironically, for its relationship to the natural environment, which one critic from the Baltimore Sun described as monumental profanity. Still, even the strongest critics of the house will generally concede that it's a beautiful work of art, and despite its impracticality, there's absolutely no question that it should continue to be preserved and maintained, if for no other reason than its brilliant aesthetics. After all, there are plenty of buildings throughout history that have become iconic, even though they aren't exactly the most successful in the structural sense. The bent pyramid in Egypt owes its unusual shape to the fact that its architects only figured out mid-construction that the building would be dangerously unstable if continued at a 54-degree angle from base to apex, so they pivoted to a shallower angle of 43 degrees halfway up in order to save the structure from collapse. And of course, who could deny the appeal of the Leaning Tower of Pisa? Fallingwater has had a tremendous influence on culture. It directly inspired the look of the fictional Van Damme house in Hitchcock's North by Northwest from 1959. Many consider Fallingwater to be one of the first examples of the mid-century modern style of architecture and interior design, and it introduced many interior features and furnishings that are common today but were rare and innovative at the time, such as indirect lighting, corner windows, and foam rubber cushions. In 1940, Wright received the silver medal from the Pan American Congress of Architects for his revolutionary design. In 2000, the American Institute of Architects hailed it as the building of the century, and it was ranked 29th on the Institute's America's Favorite Architecture list in 2007. In 2008, the Smithsonian listed Fallingwater on its Life List of 28 Places to See Before You Die, and in 2025, Time Out magazine listed it as one of the world's most beautiful buildings. Fallingwater achieved National Historical Landmark status in 1966 and was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. The Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission dubbed it a Commonwealth Treasure in 2000, and in 2019 UNESCO added it to the World Heritage List, along with 7 other buildings by Wright. Aside from the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, Fallingwater is certainly Wright's most famous work, and for good reason. The tragedy of any built environment, no matter how beautiful, is that, to some extent at least, nature must be compromised and imposed upon to accommodate the needs of humans. If only more architects would look to the example of Fallingwater when they build, that they could practice their craft and design their monuments in harmony, or at least sharing the same spotlight with nature, rather than seek to dominate it.